We on Fire Sports Podcast, The Spot, season number 5, episode number 9, and welcome in. Yeah, man, I hope you guys had an exciting weekend. Hope you guys were able to sit back and enjoy what we had across the sporting landscape. And if it's your first time listening, we on Fire Sports Podcast, The Spot. We provide hot fire takes and analysis across the sporting landscape. And if you're OG of the show, I appreciate the check-in once again. As I mentioned, man, episode number 9. In this episode, we got the National Football League concluding week number 4. Some good games across the slate. There were some teams that came in undefeated. There was also some teams that came into week number 4 winless on the year. There's a couple teams that was able to accomplish their first win of the season. Also, we got the Buffalo Bills 4-0, the only undefeated team in the AFC. On the NFC side, we got the Philadelphia Eagles, flying high on the NFC side. So things are getting kind of interesting across the National Football League. So we're going to get into that and break down week number 4 and the ins and outs of week number 4. Also, college football. Some good games over the past weekend in college football, man. We had the more notable game was the Alabama Crimson Tide taking on the Georgia Bulldogs. University of Georgia game played down in Athens as the Alabama Crimson Tide once again was able to knock off the Georgia Bulldogs. And a lot of people across the SEC know, this is a rivalry matchup. More often this is a matchup that we see in the championship game of the SEC. And Alabama has pretty much had Georgia's number over the last, 10 plus years. I mean, they've won, if I'm not mistaken, 10 of the last 11 against Georgia. It's always an epic, fashion. So shout out to Alabama, big time win. I know there was a lot of heat on Kellen DeBoer down there in Alabama, taking over obviously from Nick Saban in his second season down there. So it was a huge win for the program, just to kind of cool that hot seat down just a little bit. There was also a couple other matchups across the college football landscape that I'll get into just a little bit later on. Can't forget about the Major League Baseball playoffs, man. The playoffs are finally here. We're in the wild card round, the Major League playoffs, and just got through enjoying a few moments ago my Chicago Cubs taking game 1 of the wild card slate that they got against the San Diego Padres. Cubs good pitching in the ball game. Everybody got to hold their breath when our bullpen come in, but the bullpen was able to lock things down as the Cubs was able to win that one 3-1. Game 2 will be played tomorrow at Wrigley at 3 o'clock tomorrow. So Cubs got an opportunity on their home field to be able to close that series out and move on to the divisional round. We'll definitely see what that do. There's a lot of other, games across the slate in Major League Baseball on that wild card tip. We had the Tigers able to knock off the Guardians. Both these teams, went to war in the AL Central. The Tigers almost lost themselves out of the playoffs, but they was able to, hold on, get that wild card as the Guardians was also able to snatch that division. So these two teams lock horns once again. Tigers win this one 2-1. Skubal, man, a great pitching performance by him. He's had a good season, all-star season for him. I think he struck out 14 in this game. So the Tigers, man, even though, they kind of went on the skids towards the end of the year, this is a great opportunity to pick up the pieces and get that momentum back as they try to, move forward in the divisional round. Also, we got some games coming up tonight, most notably in the Northeast. I know everybody locked in for the classic rivalry between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees as they play, I think, at 6 o'clock Eastern on ESPN. So that game is being played as we speak here now. Also, we got the Reds and the Dodgers playing in the late night tip, 9 Eastern on ESPN. The Dodgers, this is a team that won 93 games. They was able to kind of close out the season on a high note. A lot of people predicted this team to win 100-plus ball games this year. They fell short of that. But they're still a dangerous team. I mean, they got the weapons. They got, everything that they pretty much kind of need across their slate. The Reds is a team that, I didn't think they was going to make the playoffs if you'd have asked me a month or so ago, out of that National League Central Division. But they was able to squeak in, man, get that last, round, wild card situation for them. So we'll see what they do, see if they can be giant killers as this game is being played out in Los Angeles out there in the beautiful Dodger Stadium. Always a treat every time I go out to LA and check out a ball game, man, in Chavez Ravine. And so that's what it's looking like across the Major League Baseball playoff tip. But we're going to get into what occurred last night. Last night, Monday Night Football, the NFL just coming with these doubleheaders on Monday Night Football. You just got to make a decision which, team you want to rock with, or you're going to go back and forth on the Monday night slate. The first game and the first setup was the New York Jets taking on the Miami Dolphins. Dolphins came into this game, winless. This game being played at Hard Rock Stadium. And the biggest thing really came out of this game was obviously the injury to Tyreek Hill. Oh, man. It was just kind of one of those sad sights to see. Tyreek Hill looks like he was in good spirits. He probably was going through shock at the time. A lot of people speculate. I mean, that's what it kind of looked like to me. But he a G. He'll be able to bounce back, hopefully. Not sure, though, just based on the whole business of football, if this is the last time we see Tyreek Hill in a Miami Dolphin uniform. It's been a contentious relationship over probably the last, year and a half to 2 years between him and the Dolphins. And, this thing just not on the right track for the Dolphins. Now, they was able to, pull out that victory. The Jets, they had every opportunity to win this football game. Justin Fields, returned back, off of, the concussion, off the injury. I thought that the Dolphins were smart by giving A-Chain the ball, 20 times, man. They got to balance it out. Tua, he's a mid quarterback. He's a mid guy. And there's no shot at Tua. It's just that, to me, at this point, since he's had every ample opportunity to showcase his talents down there in South Beach, we really haven't seen no results other than him being mid. And so, it almost came back to bite the Dolphins, especially, with them being, able to kind of put things back into perspective in the second half, well, primarily in the third quarter of this football game. But they was able to pull this one out. They get their first victory of the year. Aaron Glenn and the New York Jets still suffering, trying to get their first win of the year. Jets fans, as always, man, have high expectations. I'm from a fan base of my Chicago Bears who have a lot of high expectations. And I feel bad for the slate up there, man, in New Jersey or New York, area for the Jets. As they're trying to get their first victory, man. We'll see what they do in week number 5 for them. And then we had the second clip of the Monday night doubleheader jumping off between the Denver Broncos and the Cincinnati Bengals. And Broncos last week, had a nail-biting situation. I have been a big-time critic of Sean Payton. I just didn't think that, he was a guy that was talking a lot of junk when he took the job for the Denver Broncos. We had the situation with Russell Wilson, basically, cutting him and getting him up out of there. And the Broncos showed me something, through the first couple of weeks of the season. I was watching this football team, just, they got a young, talented defense. Bo Nix had it in a good rookie season last year. They got, some pieces. Obviously Sean Payton gonna try to run the football, man, and try to balance, Bo Nix out. And, I like what I'm seeing, from the Broncos. Most importantly in this game, it really was the Broncos defense. They was able to pull this one out 28-3. On the Cincinnati side, man, I was one of those people to believe that, a guy like Jake Browning, had been on the roster for a couple of years, being able to at least try to hold the fort down. We seen it a couple years ago, when Joe Burrow went down with the wrist injury. He was able to, kind of keep the boat afloat a little bit for the Cincinnati Bengals. But boy, in the last 2 weeks, man, this offense has been straight trash. I mean, under 200 yards, man, as a team, and you got two stout receivers and T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. And you got, Brown, who was a good running back. Chase Brown had a good, season last year for the Cincinnati Bengals. A lot of people thought that the pendulum was more so on the defensive side as far as them trying to get their weight up. And this offense just looks straight terrible. And I'm not sure if Jake Browning is the answer. But most importantly, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there, Cincinnati Bengals, they 2-2 on the year. They obviously lost this football game. The division of AFC North hasn't been as advertised. You got the Baltimore Ravens 1-3 in the division. You got the Pittsburgh Steelers 3-1 in first place in the division. And, we'll get into, those slates coming up in a few moments here. But Zach Taylor, man, I think it's about that time. I think it's about that time. I mean, this team looked like they was just not ready to play and not prepared on the offensive side of the ball. And I don't care if it is Jake Browning having a bad night. I mean, only putting up 3 points. I mean, we already know, just the defense from the Denver Broncos. This game was played in Denver, obviously. They was going to come to play, man. But come on, man. And so, yeah, that's getting to the point to me to where it's fluid. They lose another football game, and it could be on the outs for Zach Taylor. So we'll see what that do moving forward. But as I mentioned, man, we got a lot coming up in the slate. Coming up, I'm going to break down the entire week number 4 across the National Football League. Some of the, the points and main games that I was taking a look at. So once again, man, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate your ear. We on Fire Sports Podcast. The spot. Let's get into this week 4 in the National Football League. This was an interesting week coming in because you had some 3-0 teams coming into this week looking to move forward and get 4-0 in the season. You had some 0-3 teams, 6 of them, by the way, that, they were looking for their first victory on Sunday and over the weekend. And things kicked off in Dublin, Ireland. We had the Pittsburgh Steelers take on the Minnesota Vikings. This was an interesting matchup for me because the Minnesota Vikings last week, their defense was straight on one. I mean, just, turnovers in the touchdowns, blocks. I mean, they was just a full service type of defense, and a scoring defense. Remind me of like the 85 Bears last week, how they was getting down. Pittsburgh was a team, even though, coming into this week, they was 2-1. There was a lot of questions about the offense of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Aaron Rodgers and just the creativity and, in the offense itself. And for me, that bigger question is really for the offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith, to me, has always been what I consider a conservative play caller. I didn't expect this offense just to come out there and reinvent the wheel on the offensive side of the football. I knew they was going to try to keep it basic, run the football and be able to have Rodgers make quick and accurate throws. So this one was interesting for me because I knew that the Steelers, which I previewed this game, I knew they'd win this football game, and I knew it was going to be pretty close. But, I just think that, Steelers is a veteran organization, just with the guys that they got at the top with Tomlin, obviously, and Rodgers as well, and some of the OGs, TJ Watt, making some big plays in this football game as well. So, I'm liking what I'm seeing from the Pittsburgh Steelers. Surprisingly, they 3-1 on the year. The AFC North, a lot of people, such as myself, thought it was the best division in the National Football League, and 2 of the pillars at the quarterback position is out. Burrow's out. Looks like he's not going to be back at least until around holiday time. And then we got some new news with the whole situation with Lamar Jackson and the hamstring. So, that division is really Pittsburgh's to win. Because without Lamar Jackson, Baltimore's not the same team. Without, Joe Burrow, Cincinnati's not the same team. And so it's theirs for the taking. So we'll see what it do, man, for the rest of the season for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But I'm liking how they closed out September, going 3-1, man, in that month of September. Let's see what Mike Tomlin and his crew can do, moving forward. Another game that was interesting for me, man, just across the whole slate, we had the Buffalo Bills traveling to, not traveling, but playing at home against the New Orleans Saints. To me, this was a classic trap game. I had a feeling that, the Saints was going to put up more of a fight than what people thought was going to happen. And that's exactly what they did, even though Buffalo was able to pull this one out 31-19. Josh Allen, typical Josh Allen game, 200 yards passing, 2 touchdowns in the football game. James Cook, again, another Bill on the ground with a TD to throw in there. And, Buffalo made the plays defensively when they needed to make the plays. They only allowed really one score in each quarter of the game from the New Orleans Saints. And so, that's what the champions do. You take on all comers. This game was played up in Buffalo. To me, it's kind of surprising, too, is that Buffalo has had 4 home games in the first 5 games of the season for them. I thought whoever the schedule makers in that situation, that's just kind of like, I don't know what's going on with that. But, big time win for the Bills as they improved to 4-0 in the season. And the Saints are still winless on the year. Another interesting matchup, and This wasn't a matchup that I really had interest in going into the week, but it turned out to be an upset special on Sunday, man. The New York Football Giants starting Jackson Dart, his first NFL start, put Russell Wilson on the bench. Giants coming into this football game was 0-3 on the year. The Chargers on the other end of the pendulum, 3-0 on the season coming in. It's my team. I think that'll win the AFC West this year. I went ahead and put it all out there. I was liking what I was seeing from the Chargers, and man, the games are not played on paper. They played on the field. Big time win for the New York Giants, man. Jackson Dart looked nice in the game. Just a sad story really in the game, mostly for the New York Giants, is Malik Neighbors going out with the ACL injury. His season is over. Just when they turned the page as far as putting in a new, exciting type of quarterback in under the hand for the New York Giants. So I just kind of felt bad about that, man. But a big time victory for them. I'm not sure how hot that city is for Dable and Joe Shane up in New York, but this was at least able to cool it off at least for the next week or so. So we'll see what that do. The Chargers, man, you got to do better, man. This is a game that you got to win. Really put yourself in pole position in the AFC. This is a setback for them. We'll see what they do moving forward. I still got faith in Harbaugh and company, man. So shout out, to the Giants. A big time victory for them in their first victory of the season. Then we had the classic showdown game, man, for me. These two teams met in the playoffs a couple years ago. These two teams, in the NFC might see each other down the road in a playoff situation, and it's the Philadelphia Eagles on par with the Tampa Bay Bucks. And the Eagles coming into this game, I had a feeling that they was just going to do what Eagles do, be able to win an ugly football game, whether it's in the 30s, whether it's in the teens, they'd be able to pull and get out a victory. The Giants but the Eagles was able to win this one 31-25. And the Eagles came out looking real good in the first half, pretty much, of this football game. They was up, 24-3 at halftime. 24-6 at halftime. And, I just thought that, the Eagles, even though their offense kind of tapered off a little bit towards the end of the first half, especially with them not being able to throw the football. We all know the elephant in the room with the Philadelphia Eagles. What's going on with A.J. Brown? I just don't understand it. I got this man on my fantasy team, straight donut in the fantasy column, man. 2 receptions, 7 yards. It just looked like, Jalen Hurts, just go through stretches to where he's not an effective quarterback throwing the football. I think Jalen Hurts is more of a rhythm guy. It's all about rhythm with Jalen Hurts. And in this football game, in the second half, he had no rhythm at all. Lucky enough for the Eagles, they was able to score 24 points in the first half of this football game. Only had 7 the rest of the way. Baker Mayfield tried to put on that cape once again for the Tampa Bay Bucks. And Baker, man, he's just tough as nails. You just don't get more of a gritty competitor right now than Baker Mayfield. They had a few guys out. Mike Evans didn't play in this football game. We saw Chris Godwin get on the field for the first time this season. Bucky Irvin making some big time plays, big time route running and reception for that long 70-yard touchdown. And so Tampa, they fall to 3-1 on the year. I think it'll be brighter days for them. At the end of the day, man, they took the champs, went to a late, round decision for the Philadelphia Eagles in this one. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think these two teams will meet once again in the NFC playoffs at some point. And so it was a good, exciting football game just to watch. I actually sat back, relaxed, and checked this game out with the family and everything, man. It was a good showcase, just on the NFC side of things. And so the Eagles remain undefeated on the season, 4-0. And, man, we'll see if these Eagles keep flying, man, as they move into week number 5 on the year. Another game that caught my interest was a real good play football game outside of the blunder that was made in this game, man. Oh, my God, man. And we got the Indianapolis Colts against the Los Angeles Rams. The Colts came into this game undefeated. They was the talk of the National Football League through the first 3 weeks of the year. Just a surprising team. And Danny Dimes, playing some good football for the Indianapolis Colts. Jonathan Taylor, fresh off a 3-touchdown game last week for the Colts. The defense of the Indianapolis Colts looking stout. And, I knew that this was a game, and for me, it's really about tiers, whether you break down the tier from the NFC side or the AFC side. We all, watchers of football know that the Los Angeles Rams is a more veteran and more put-together type of unit. They've been in a few of these, type of grid lock type of games. I thought that Danny Dimes, I thought he could have played better. We had a situation, though, with, Adon Mitchell just man, just costly. I mean, that play was costly. Throwing the ball basically before he crossed the goal line, went out of bounds before it crossed the goal line. Ended up going from a touchdown to a touchback. And that was really the play of the game. This game was tight, back and forth, but, both teams, playing good defenses at times, both offenses, just kind of staying on mid mode. They was able to make some big plays in this football game, but it wasn't, a shootout as one, we'll predict going into this week 4 matchup. But shout out to the Rams and Sean McVay, man. They improved to 3-1 on the year. The Colts, they dropped to 3-1 on the season for them in that AFC South. We'll see if the Colts able to bounce back in week number 4 and see what it do. Then we had, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, the Baltimore Ravens and the Kansas City Chiefs. Chiefs able to win this game 37-20. I already talked about this, in the intro. This was a big time matchup, man, for the both teams really coming into this game 1-2. You don't want to fall to 1-3. The Ravens got KO'd in this game, bad enough. You got the injury to Lamar Jackson with a hamstring injury. And this thing is a slippery slope for the Baltimore Ravens. Their defense really had some guys out, and it showed out there on the field as they fell up short in this football game. One would think this team is talented enough really to be able to bounce back. This kind of reminds me, we'll take a little trip down the time machine real quick. Is that this reminds me of John Elway before Terrell Davis got to Denver back in the 90s. Where just a talented guy, MVP caliber quarterback, primetime quarterback out there. And a lot of people was just saying, hey, man, look, Baltimore, even though they was, one of the best running football teams in the National Football League before Derrick Henry got there, but he just added another dynamic, and one would think that there'd be enough to get this team over the top. But this is a snake-bitten football team, as I alluded to earlier, man, and this was a big loss for this organization. John Harbaugh looking like he's getting older by the day over there on the sidelines. We'll see what it do for the Ravens moving forward. Most importantly, we had to check in on that availability of Lamar Jackson for next week. We'll definitely see what that do and give you guys obviously an update as we get closer to week number 5. But good victory for the Chiefs. They finally getting guys back. Xavier Worthy had a big time football game in this one. Patrick Mahomes throwing for the 4 touchdowns, looking like classic Patrick Mahomes, by the way. And so I'm liking what I'm seeing from the Chiefs. They're a team that, I do some dirt on this football team because I still think they got some days of reckoning, moving forward, just from a hungriness standpoint. So we'll see what they do. But it was a good victory for the Kansas City Chiefs, knocking off the Baltimore Ravens, improving themselves to 2-2 on the year. And I couldn't close out week number 4 without showing some love to my Chicago Bears taking on the Las Vegas Raiders out there in Vegas at Allegiant Stadium. Now, this was a football game for my Chicago Bears. It really was a balance of 2 halves for my Bears. We came out, kind of just, field goal city, in the first half of this football game. And then in the second half, that's when the offense started to get clicking a little bit. Good job for Swift being able to not have his head, in the dumps with the Bears, not being able to run the football at all in the first half. And so for him to be able to bounce back, Caleb Williams making big time plays with Rome Odunze, using his feet in this football game, being able to make plays. The Bears defense, causing 4 turnovers in this one. Geno Smith, a straight turnover machine. But this team, the Raiders, they was poised. And shout out to, Ashton Jeanty. He had an outstanding performance last week. 2 touchdowns, receiving also 2, a rushing touchdown. Out there looking like a Bo Jackson in the silver and black. So for my Bears, big time play at the end, special teams block of the field goal. For my Bears being able to get 2-2 on the years, my Bears mosey on along to week number 5, Byville. Get a chance to kind of relax and see what the season do moving forward for my Bears. For the Raiders, they dropped 1-3 on the year. Pete Carroll in his first season out there in Las Vegas is just going to be an uphill climb, especially when Geno Smith looking like a turnover machine. So we'll see if it's brighter days out there in Vegas for the Raiders moving forward. For my Bears, get to 500. This division, we looking sweet. 2 victories in a row for my young Bears up there in Chicago. I know a lot of people are excited up there. So, man, that's a good little win for my young Bears and Bet Down out there. And to wrap things up in week number 4, as I mentioned, we got into the Monday night game a little bit earlier. But the young Packers on that Sunday night football against the Dallas Cowboys, the triumphant return of Michael Parsons down there in Dallas. And this was a game for me. It really was about the defenses. meaning that was the Packers defense going to look outstanding in this football game? Is the Dallas Cowboys defense finally going to man up and just have a quality football game because they've been straight up hot garbage and hot trash over the first 3 weeks of the season? And the answer on that was no and no. No to the Cowboys turning over a new leaf on the defensive end, and Green Bay, no, not bringing their defense down there to Dallas to take on the Cowboys. This game, 40-40 tie, split it right down the middle. You know, it was a good offensive game. It was video game style, you know, just both teams just literally not being able to stop each other. There's a lot of talk across the National Football League about this whole tie rule, man. So we'll go ahead and jump on the soapbox real quick and swift. Now, for me, I'm a traditionalist. There has been ties in football and college as well as, you know, in professional football. You know, I'm an OG out here, man, so I've seen a lot of ties in the game, especially back in college football with the old AP poll before we went into this, you know, new playoff type of system. So, you know, I've seen it crack before. You know, I'm not oblivious to it. That don't mean I like it. And I just think that in the NFL, with everything being tiebreakers and so forth, and I know the players really don't want to play OT out there, but at the end of the day, man, a win is a win and a loss is a loss. I think that the NFL can maybe go to the college kind of rule, you know, where you put the ball on the 20-yard line basically and have teams just sudden death it out. You know, that would be something that, you know, would be interesting for me to do. But this whole tie thing, man, I just think it's a lot at stake about, you know, teams getting to the playoffs. There's jobs always on the line, man, for teams, you know, trying to get into the playoffs and so forth. And so, not really a fan of the tie, man. I think they should still go to that college rule, man. Just put the ball on the 25-yard line, sudden death style, man. Go ahead and close that thing out with one team, you know, being able to pull out a victory in the game. But that's my look across week number 4 across the National Football League. As I mentioned, we had some teams coming in 0-3 into this week. We had some teams 3-0. We had a couple teams who was 0-3 win a couple games. We had a couple teams that was 3-0 lose. So, interesting week across the National Football League. Coming up, I got the rest of the show. But first and foremost, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate you. Yeah. We on Fire Sports Podcast. The spot. Before we get out of here, man, don't forget to check us out, man, on Facebook. We on Fire Sports Podcast. Also, too, on Twitter, X at We on Fire Sports. Also, where all podcasts can be listened to as well as Podbean. And before we close it out, we're going to take a little tour of duty across college football. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in the show, man, Alabama was able to knock off the Georgia Bulldogs, man, up in Athens. Exciting football game, but Alabama just seemed to just have Georgia's number so far, man, just over the last 10 plus years, when, if I believe correct, 10 of the last 11 against them. You know, that was interesting. Shout out, man, to the crowd, man, up in Virginia, man. Virginia knocked off, you know, Florida State, 46-38, man, and 2 overtimes. An exciting football game. The most exciting part of it for me was the end, man, just with the crowd just storming, the fans just storming the field. I hope nobody got hurt, man, but it was just kind of just crazy just to see the 2 players in the end zone, man, just straight disappear on the final whistle. So, man, shout out and big victory to the University of Virginia. Also, we got Ohio State. They rolled over, Washington 24-6. Ohio State still the number 1 team in the country. Looking like they rocking and rolling, man. They're going to have some good contests coming up in the Big Ten, one of the best conferences in America. So I think that, so far so good for Ohio State. They're 4-0 in the year, but we'll see what the Buckeyes do moving forward as well. Speaking of a Big Ten tilt, we had the whiteout up there in Penn State, Oregon traveling up to Penn State College to take on the Penn State Nittany Lions. And as we always know with James Franklin, the head coach of the Penn State Nittany Lions, this team just can't win a big-time game. Every time you believe that Penn State is the best team in the country or one of the best teams in the country, got a
stout quarterback, being able to run the football with 2 stout running backs, a defense that's, on the come up. Losing 30-24 in your own building, even though it did go, a couple overtimes, man, was, just not the move. But, now with the college football playoff, it's not going to, hurt Penn State moving forward. As long as they're able to, kind of get, where they need to be and getting that, stay in that top 12, which I believe they would. So we'll see what it do. Also, Ole Miss, shout out to Ole Miss. This LSU and Ole Miss game I was able to check out a little bit over the weekend, and Ole Miss was able to pull this one out 24-19. LSU and Brian Kelly came in with this game, with good momentum, 4-0 in the year. Kelly hadn't started 4-0 since he had been at LSU, coming from Notre Dame. So, this one, was a tough, SEC type of matchup, man. But shout out to Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin, man, as they're 5-0 and undefeated so far in the season. They could be a dangerous team, especially once we get, later on in the season, get a little closer to the college football playoff. We may have a whole situation down there, man, with the Ole Miss Rebels, with Lane Kiffin and what he's able to do down there, man. And so we'll see what it do, man, across the landscape. As I mentioned earlier, Alabama, they was able to knock off Georgia. That was, big time SEC matchup as well. Georgia Tech, a team that's been surprising so far this season, was able to win in overtime against Wake Forest in a nail-biting game that I thought that Wake Forest was going to upset them. But Georgia Tech, brought on the umph in the final part of the game. So congratulations to them being 5-0 on the season. And before we close it out, can't forget about my Illinois Fighting Illini, man. We had USC on the slate. This game was played down in Champaign. Spent many weekends, man, in the stadium, so it was good to see it on television, man. It's one of the most beautiful atmospheres, Memorial Stadium, that you got across college football. Illinois coming off that embarrassing loss to Indiana the previous week, winning 34-32 over USC. Both these teams now 4-1 on the year. Hopefully Illinois can kind of move up in the rankings, man, as things get real tight in the Big Ten coming up. But before we close the door out of here, man, we're going to circle back to the National Football League real quickly, because I got my Big Five power rankings through week number 4 across the National Football League. And at number 5, I got them Los Angeles Chargers coming in at number 5, man. This team last week, they was number 3 on my power rankings, and they was trending upward. And they went to New York and I'm not sure still what happened, especially losing to, a guy, in Jackson Dart's his first NFL start. Malik Neighbors, unfortunately, got the ACL injury. His season is over with, and I hope he get on the mend. This was a game easily for the Chargers to win. Fumbled it, just straight fumbled the whole game. Losing 21-18. I got them coming in at number 5. I think it'll be brighter days for the Chargers. They 3-1 on the year. There's a couple teams behind them, as far as in my power ranking, ladders that could easily have this number 5 spot. Team just like the Pittsburgh Steelers and so forth. But I'm going to keep the Chargers in at number 5, man. I believe in Jim Harbaugh and being able to get this team, where it needs to be, winning the division and making a deep playoff run. So we'll see what it do. At number 4, I got the Detroit Lions coming in at number 4, man. This is a team that after week 1, everybody wanted to bury them. Both the offense and defensive coordinators are now head coaches across the National Football League. There's a lot of, just coaches and, guys just around the Detroit Lions last season that's no longer there. And ever since week 1, they pretty much look like the Detroit Lions as we knew them the last couple of years. Jared Goff playing good football, them being able to run the football. Them being able to, go to their stud guys and Moran St. Brown. Also, too, my man Jameson Williams been having a good year. Laporta look like he's, on the come up, man, this 3rd season. So, I'm liking what I'm seeing from Dan Campbell and the Detroit Lions. The defense is playing, above average so far this season for me. I got them, man, coming in at number 4. At number 3, this is a team that just reminds me of, if we took a tilt into the boxing world, just a well-tuned boxer that, they got a couple losses on their record, but they're just a team that is, trusted because they've been through the fire. And this team in particular, they don't have a couple losses on their record, but I'm talking about the Los Angeles Rams coming in 3-1 on the year so far. This is a team that, they've had a good, what I call strength of schedule so far. They took on the Indianapolis Colts who, tried to knock them off. Colts had came in undefeated so far on the season for them. And the Rams just showed you that veteran team, a team that, has been through the mud. Also, too, with, scheming up McVay, they always going to make counter moves on you, man. So I'm liking what I'm seeing from the Los Angeles Rams so far this season. Obviously, this is a team that easily could be 4-0. They lost to the Philadelphia Eagles on a blocked field goal, obviously, and returned back for a touchdown last week. But I'm liking what I'm seeing so far with Matt Stafford, who's looking healthy. The Rams got, a good little backfield with Corum and my man Kyron Williams. Devontae Adams is, doing his thing. Puka Nacua right now look like the best receiver in the National Football League. I got the Rams coming in at number 3. At number 2, this is a team that, is undefeated. Look like they may be marching themselves through the AFC and finally being able to get themselves to the Super Bowl since the first time since the mid-90s. And yeah, man, I'm talking about them Buffalo Bills, Bill Mafia. It all starts and ends with Josh Allen, man. This guy's just, reigning MVP, put the team, on his back, once again. Had a nice little dust up with the New Orleans Saints. I knew the Saints was a team that was going to play them closer than what people had advertised. They was able to pull out the victory 31-19 against the Saints. James Cook, another bill on the ground, touchdown on the ground. Everything looks smooth sailing for Sean McDermott. This team, like I said, is 4-0 on the season, only undefeated team in the AFC. I got them coming in at number 2. At number 1, this is the most winningest, frustrating team in the National Football League, and it's been like that for the last couple of seasons. And y'all all know who I'm talking about, man. It's the Philadelphia Eagles. This is a team that win ugly. It may not be, kumbaya, with A.J. Brown and also to Devontae Smith just really not being involved like that. And Jalen Hurts going from looking surgical to looking just economical. And so Philadelphia, like I said, man, for them, the talent is there. I think they're one of the most talented teams across the National Football League. They locked into their style. They'll beat you how they need to beat you and keep it moving. But this list, it could be subject to change. It's not, Philadelphia is in stone. Meaning that, to me, the Buffalo Bills kind of right behind them just slightly. Just in regards because I think that Philadelphia, pound for pound, has more talent, pound for pound, than Buffalo. But we'll see what it do, man. The week number 5 coming up. This thing might be subject to change. But I ain't going to hold you, man. We're going to get out of here, man. First and foremost, man, I appreciate y'all. Appreciate all the love and the feedback. We'll be back at the back end of the week coming up to preview week number 5 and also to whatever we got across the sporting landscape. Obviously, some of these wild card baseball series will be completed by then, so we'll get into that. But once again, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate you. Yeah. We on Fire Sports Podcast.